think you should be able to see my screen now. Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Ellis Cain, and I'll be presenting our study on the statistical regularities in naturalistic naming events. And this is work that I did with Dr. Riskin and then Dr. Yu. So one of the main challenges of word learning is figuring out the correct label-object mapping, which Quine called referential uncertainty, since the correct mapping is neither inherently clear nor explicitly stated. Some proposed ambiguity reduction methods suggest that it is based on social cues, like the listener being able to understand speaker referential intent, or some type of fast mapping method. Another type proposes that the ambiguity is reduced across naming events, and the one that we'll be looking at specifically here is cross-situational learning. So cross-situational learning is a type of associative statistical learning where language learners are proposed to track label-object co-occurrences over a set of ambiguous naming events, like those you see in the bottom. Then, over time, as learners aggregate more information, they can learn these initial label-object mappings. In the lab, this has been studied by presenting participants with a set of ambiguous naming events, like the one you see on the right there. For a given naming event, there's a certain amount of novel objects displayed on the screen, and then the corresponding labels are played over speakers in no specific order, such that it's not always like the first object that's named is the one in the top left. But these label object mappings are consistent throughout the experiment, which then learners are proposed to utilize such regularities to learn. These experiments have been designed explicitly to test if learners can aggregate information across trials and in conditions with varying statistical regularities, such as the number of objects on screen or the number of repetitions, target words. But throughout all of these, both infants, children, and adults were all able to correctly identify the label object mapping at a probability higher than chance across conditions after training in these experiments. With these stimuli, the stimuli in these experiments, they're very tightly controlled. But does this learning method, scale up to the real world? A study by Medina and colleagues would suggest that there's a mismatch between the lab and real world naming events. Based on the human simulation paradigm, they used third-person video of naturalistic naming events as stimuli for a cross-situational learning experiment and found decreased participant performance, suggesting that there's not enough information to support statistical learning. This lab-based learning method then would not scale up to the real-world environment with naturalistic learning input. But still, what does natural learning input look like for infant word learners? While the Medina study used third-person views as naturalistic learning input, other studies have shown that the third-person view is actually quite different from the child's own point of view. So therefore, in order to evaluate how cross-situational learning scales to real-world learning input, we set out to analyze naturalistic naming events from the child's perspective to determine the everyday statistical regularities of naturalistic learning input, namely the temporal regularities of parent naming, and then the visual scene composition during the naming event. We also looked at how infants select information through their attention based on those statistics. So the cross-situational learning studies had, first, temporally, they had different toys named in a random order within a single trial. And then across trials, the time between the same toy being named twice varied since the order of the different naming events were had a consistent layout. So we'll be trying to quantify the equivalent regularities in the naturalistic naming events. So we used a naturalistic parent-child toy play dataset from Dr. Yu's lab. In the sessions, both parent and children wore head-mounted eye trackers and front-facing cameras, like you see on the right. They played with a set of 24 toys and were given the instructions to play as they would at home, and also to keep the child seated and interacting with the toys. Parent speech was transcribed at the utterance level, and utterances less than 400 milliseconds apart were collapsed into a single naming event. The average session length was about 8 minutes, giving us around 291 minutes total of footage. So the parent naming events were then synchronized with the data from the child eye gaze so that we could see where they're looking at, as well as the object detection data from the first person videos, such that at the onset of each parent naming event, we could extract what the child was looking at, what proportion of time they fixated on that object, which objects were in view, and then the size of those objects. We used a 3-second data extraction window. In this first study, we aimed to capture the temporal aspect of parent naming behavior. Namely, we looked for patterns in the inter-onset interval, which is the time between pairs of parent naming events. We looked at same and different naming event pairs, like you see in the figure on the screen. Then we measured a child attention to see how such regularities impacted how the child selected information. So overall, there are an average of 41 naming events per subject, and different naming event pairs were more frequent than same naming event pairs. This first graph here just shows the raw counts of parent naming to see how likely they are to name the same or different toy as a function of the inter-onset interval. We filtered to just the first 20 seconds to look at the temporally close naming events. So for naming events within the same utterance, parents are more likely to name 2 different toys, and different is in red and then same is in blue. And again, just a note, utterances less than 400 milliseconds apart were collapsed into a single utterance. However, for naming events that were in separate utterances, parents are more likely to repeat the same label within 4 seconds of the first naming event, but this decreases as the inter-onset interval increases. So in order to see if child attention differs based on the time between parent naming events, we calculated the proportion of time that the child spent fixated on the target of the second naming event based on the inter-onset interval. So here, the small shaded points are showing the individual attention proportions for each second, while the larger points show the average attention proportions. We didn't include the within utterance naming events here. But within these temporally close naming events, we found that children spend similar proportions of time fixating on the second named target for both repeated and different toys, an average of 0.41 versus 0.38. The attention to target also did not change based on IOI for both types of naming pairs. We used a mixed effects model to test the relationship between the attention proportion and then the inter-onset interval and naming pair type, which this indicated that there's no significant relationship between all variables and that there's neither an interaction between IOI and naming pair type as well. So temporally, we found that parents are more likely to name different toys within a single utterance, and then across utterances, they're initially more likely to repeatedly name the same toy twice, but this switches to different toys being more likely after 4 seconds. Still, these regularities did not seem to have a strong relationship with child attention. So in this next study, we aim to quantify the visual scene composition during the naming events. We used YOLO object detection, which was trained on a subset of hand annotated data to generate bounding boxes for toys in each frame, like you see on the left. These bounding boxes are XY coordinates with length, width, and pixels, such that they indicate the area occupied by the toy in the child's view based on the front-facing camera. Using this object detection data, we first look at the average toy sizes of the nth largest toys, and then the number of toys in the foreground. Then, to find patterns in scene composition, we represented each scene as a vector of the top 6 largest toy sizes, regardless of identity, and then used an unsupervised clustering algorithm to try to find prototypical scenes. Like in the first study, we also measured child attention based on these prototypical scenes. So there are an average of 17 toys in the child's view during a naming event, regardless of toy size. So then here, again, we ranked the toys by size in a scene during a naming event, and then we calculated the average size of the ranked largest objects. And so from this, we can see that very few toys occupy a relatively large portion of the child's view. The largest toy on average occupies about 15% of the child's view, with a range from 6% to about 23%. whereas the second largest toy only occupies about 10% of the child's view. We then tried different toy size cutoffs for the foreground. The 7% cutoff, or toys larger than 7% cutoff, that gave us an average of 2.47 toys per scene. The cutoff of 5% gave us 4.38 toys per scene, and then a cutoff of 3% for object size gave us 9.13 toys per scene on average. The mean shift clustering algorithm identified 5 prototypical scenes, which you can see here on the slide. The counts for each cluster are in the bottom right. And now you can see the examples of the prototypical scenes on the top side. There's a variety of scene compositions that were identified. Cluster 1 included scenes that included like toys that were small in size and had a small range. Cluster 5 had scenes where there's one large object in view, whereas clusters 2 through 4 had a few objects that were large in view and the rest were in the background. With the exception of cluster 3, the named toy was most frequently the largest toy. And then for clusters 2 and 5, this occurred for more than half of the scenes in the cluster. These graphs here now are showing on average the longest 6 looks per naming event for each cluster, regardless of the identity of the fixated toy. From this, we can see that even though the identified prototypical scenes vary quite a bit in their composition, infants still distribute their gaze in a similar fashion. One long look within a few short looks. Then when we add the proportion of attention to the named toy, we see that the values are similar across clusters as well. These are also often lower than the longest look, which suggests that the child doesn't always look the longest at the target during the naming event. And then from the mixed effects model, we found that the target size rank significantly predicted child attention to target, and that children were more likely to fixate on the target for cluster 3 relative to cluster 1. So spatially, we found that based on the different foreground filters, there were an average of 2.47, 4.38, or 9.13 toys in the foreground per view. And then the mean shift clustering algorithm identified a variety of prototypical scenes that varied in their composition. And then these results suggest that what the child is seeing and hearing in the moment matters more than repeated naming toys. So in this study, we analyzed the temporal and spatial regularities of learning input in a real-world environment. The key differences here between this type of data and that used in Medina's HSP study is the use of child's perspective data, since previous studies have suggested that the child's view greatly differs from that of third-person views. We found that not all objects have the same size and that the target size was the strongest driver of child attention, while the time between namings did not seem to influence child attention. Lastly, we did find matches in certain aspects of the temporal and spatial regularities of parent naming, which suggests that these types of statistics do exist in natural learning input and could support statistical learning. Therefore, based on what the child selects with their attention, that amount of information is comparable to the cross-situational learning experiments, though it's not a perfect match. So future cross-situational learning studies could then be modified to more closely emulate this type of real-world input. For example, like designing the visual scene to match one of the prototypical scenes, or using the toy sizes that we found, or even using the child's perspective video as stimuli, similar to some of Zhang and colleagues' work, which used short vignettes of first-person video from naturalistic play for a cross-situational learning experiment. The current study also looked at the temporal and spatial regularities separately, which future work could explore the potential interactions or relationships between the two. The temporal analysis also looked at just consecutive pairs of naming events, which this could be improved by looking at like burstiness of parent naming. And future studies could also integrate parents' perspective to explore the causality of these regularities. But I wanted to thank you all for your attention. I also wanted to acknowledge the grant that funded the data used in this study. And if you have any other questions afterwards or want to get in touch, the contact info and lab websites are on the screen as well.
Thanks a lot. Any questions so far? Maybe I can start. So if I understand correctly, you use the object size, the toy size, as a proxy for kind of the salience of the toys in the view field of the child. Is that, do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so I guess like the main kind of like reason for using that was, let me actually go back to that slide. So like in the original cross-situational learning experiments, like all the toys were all the same size. So we were trying to see kind of like what the size of the objects would be in natural learning input. But then when we looked at the foreground, that was more of trying to see which objects were most salient in the child's view.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think there's quite some potential also to extend this this measure of salience using some, I'm aware of some machine learning methods that actually try to quantify the salience of certain regions in an image, not only based on the size of objects in that region, but also based on how much, how far they are from the center, how what is their color probably. So there's a lot of different factors that play a role, I can imagine. And of course, you can use a machine learning model that would be maybe a black box model and harder to interpret, but could be interesting if you would find a higher correlation then with your measures. And then later you could also see then which kind of factors actually drive the salience apart from the object size.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Any questions online? Or in person?
Hi, thanks a lot. It's really interesting to see this sort of data put together. My question is, since we're talking about things like prototypical naming scenes, one of the other differences in the Medina paper that you're mentioning is a lot of their words are not toys. They're both more general words like thing, because they're just these common nouns, and less like immediately holdable things. And so I was just wondering how you think about that difference and whether you think that this work sort of is going to naturally scale up to objects that aren't sort of holdable and playable in that same way.
That's a good question. Yeah, I guess like these results specifically, like they mainly apply to like toy play, like you're saying, with like objects that are like holdable and would be like more salient in like the child's view when they're playing with their parents. I do think there would be some differences when you scale up to like not a toy play context, just because like you're saying, like the objects may be larger or more farther away, you may not even be able to like interact with them. Yeah, so I do think it would be different.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there's a question online. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. It says, "This is absolutely brilliant work. I can't help but think how this skewed salience distribution would translate to the input for blind children. Do you think it would be possible to study this with respect to tactile information?"
And kind of like a clarification question for tactile information, that would just be like the texture of the object, right? And like size and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would translate, but you may have to like find a like different way to look at like salience in a tactile sense. I'm not too familiar with work with blind language learning, but I think you would have to find some way to like measure maybe if it's like slippery or there's like a fur texture or something like that as maybe like being more salient. But I think the analysis could definitely carry over to that type of information.
Okay, I think we can take one last question if there's anything. Otherwise, this concludes the session Language Acquisition 3. Thanks again to all the speakers and all the people asking the very interesting questions.